And so one of the things that's happening, I'm getting a little bit outside of my lane here in terms of what I was going to talk to you all about. You all
Well, no,
know
this is great. Thank
that
you.
remote control operations have gone on in rail yards for going on almost like 25 years or something like that. And we've always had big concerns about the question of remote control, but they were generally until now restricted to yards. And so, you know, and unfortunately, the operating crafts, rather than saying, well, this is a really bad idea, there isn't any good side to this, they fight amongst themselves over, well, I get to do it instead of you, or you get to do it instead of me, which is conceding the bad thing. And the thing that has happened, and this is strictly in a way you could say it's parochial interest of us, in the unions or whatever, because we can't get a united bargaining coalition with all the unions in one coalition because the two biggest operating crafts are fighting over who gets to do the remote control. And in particular, the carriers are taking remote control on the road. That's the thing I'm here to tell you about. They're expanding the use outside of yard limits, and and I would argue, there might be some people who would contest this with me, but I would argue that it's a back end run on two-person crew, and it's even a back end run on the question of remote control trains. Because if they do this and they're really successful at really rolling it out and they don't really get any real opposition from the craft, then the next manager that comes along is going, well, okay, I did it 10 miles out. Now I'm going to do it 50 miles out. Or now I'm not only going to have the guy using the bell pack, but I'm going to have him in Dubuque instead of in Texas or whatever the case may be. Now that's not happening right now, but the point is that it's an escalation.
They're
It's an
laying the
aggressive
groundwork.
escalation. It's an aggressive escalation on their part. And they got all kinds of arguments, as they always do, about how, well, we actually have a better safety record, which usually rolls up to the fact that they were much less, they're moving less freight, which you can see in the white paper. The white paper will detail how and that's an important thing for us, because if we want a safe green future and stuff, we need to use railroads, but they're not. They've figured out how to make money without running trains.
I first read about the um, remote control. I never thought I'd be I'd be saying that word along with trains in the same sentence. I mean, who in the world thought that this was a good idea? Even if they wanted to save a bundle of money, to control a train, what do they call it? A console?
A consist.
Yes, a
Yeah.
consist that large, and even if it's small, um, with no one on board. I mean, this has gone off
Carrying what they
the
carry.
yeah, this has gone off
Yeah.
the rails. Excuse the pun. I mean, I who thought of this?
Well, it's the same people, right? They go out in the yard and they think, okay, I'm the manager. It's my job to, make efficiencies. And so they see that there's two guys, right? There's one on one end and there's one on the other end. And, in the yard, especially with this back and forth stuff, the whole question of the engineer versus the conductor, it gets a little bit murky and gets into this weird argument, and I can tell you because I'm an engineer, right? So it's like when I'm going backwards, the conductor is my eyes, right? So he can tell me what he sees, and because I can't see it, but then he could look at it and say, no, the engineer is my hands, right? So he's looking at the stuff and he's telling me what to do, right? So that's where some of the dispute comes in. But what happened is they figured out that they had the technology. It's the same way that they in a sense, it's one of the reasons why they have the longer and heavier trains, because they can now do what they call displaced power. So they can put a locomotive, 100 cars back and another locomotive 200 cars back and run them all, with remote control, basically, So that's how you can get those 3 mile and more long trains. I like it. A lot of people don't realize that, but it is a form of remote control. But in these yards, what they go out there and they think is like, well, okay, we're going real slow and we're only going back and forth and we're only doing that. So why do we have to have, full rigid crews for the whole thing? How come we can't have just one guy with an Xbox controller on his belt and, do the switching and the making up and stuff like that? And that's how that comes about. And especially early on, there were a lot of fatalities and things, and they still are some of those things that go on. But then one of the problems is that there's nobody to find out, right? So, they come along later and find the cut up body or whatever. But anyway,
and it's my understanding that whistleblowers get punished. Is that correct? Does that still go on?
Well, we have some protections. Every year. I mean, years ago there was a big lot of lauding about how there was now whistleblower protection, and then every year since then, just like with family medical leave and other things like that, the corporations weaken them. They weaken them each legislative session. They pass new regulations to make it more difficult to take advantage of those things or whatnot. So it's a constant process. And that's certainly true with the whistleblower protection. And in some cases, what will happen is the lawyers who do that, they'll win a case. There's a famous case of a guy whose his wife actually has been a big supporter of RW over the years, got fired and they kept finding in his favor at every stage. And he eventually died of a cancer, like, I don't know, 4 years or 5 years or something after all this stuff started. And he still never got any restitution because they have deep pockets and they can stall and they can reconvene and they can do this and they can do that. And it just, so yes, there's whistleblower protection. Now, in this case, it's really there's not per se a whistle. In other words, the federal government has already, and the unions have already said, okay, you can do what we call RCO, remote control operation. So if you hear RCO, that's what we're talking about. They all have said, okay, there are rules about RCO. As long as you follow those rules, that there isn't an issue of whistleblower. I would argue that the carriers, I mean, this thing with the RCO is proof that they are not, what would you call it? They're not shy. They're not afraid. They are aggressive. They are aggressive about pushing even stuff like what happened in East Palestine. And you could tell because of the way they behaved towards the NTSB people that they are not afraid. And so our job this is going to sound very rhetorical and everything like that, but it's our job to make them afraid. It's to make them afraid to do these things. So
this remote control that they use, what does it look like? I mean, is it like really flimsy that you like get from Game World or something like that?
I've never run one myself. They call them belt packs. They have a little belt that goes around your waist and a little box, and it's supposed to be set up so that if you were to trip, for example, and fall over, that it would, fail safe. But at least in the early years, I do know one of the problems is that there was, it was a situation that kind of optimized the guys to maybe not do the same, in other words, maybe not have the belt fastened because it made it quicker for them to get to the switch or get on the ladder or whatever they had to do. And then they had no fail-safe protection. Now, I know that Jerry in particular knows one of our RWU activist. His name is Cameron. Cameron was one of our party that went up to Lac-Mégantic last year. Cameron is now involved in that kind of an operation on the UP. And he knows a lot more details on it. And at some point, if you all really want to know more about it, he might be willing to talk to you all about it. Sometimes they do operate in a team. Sometimes they do operate with two people. But I can just tell you, because I've done all these jobs before on the actual trains, that it's not the same thing to be at the controls of the locomotive as it is to be standing on the wayside somewhere looking at stuff and have to operate a joystick.
Right. Right. So it in a perfect world, how many if you had a a say so in this, how many crew members ideally should be on board a train? Should it be more than two, or
I don't
two
think there's
sufficient?
any, that really depends, like if you're working a light locomotive, you really want two, in my opinion, and I've done that plenty. But if you got bigger consists, the more it is, the more it makes sense that there maybe be an additional person or a couple of additional people. And the big thing is that you want to have some kind of assurance that there's going to be a real skilled, knowledgeable person paying attention on the operating end, whatever it is, if it's going backwards or going forward, of the equipment. And so whatever that needs in terms of a crew, let's say that for a fact that you got a problem halfway through your train. One thing you could do if your conductor was on the head end is you could pull the train down 150 cars, and then he could do whatever he had to do. But you can't then turn around and back the train up to get him back on the head end, because you'd be shoving the train blind. So, and there's tech. I mean, I'm not a Luddite. There's a role for cameras, and there's a role for remote stations and things. Or we had locomotives on Amtrak that had a control stand at the rear of the locomotive, so that a single person could technically, it's still not best practice, but technically, if they had to go backwards, they could go to the rear end and they could run the controls and go backwards and be able to see what was going on. But we need real skilled, give us tools. Don't just try and figure out cheap ass ways to get rid of employees.
Mm-hmm.
Give us real tools and
Oh,
let us have skilled people.
now we gotta give this an R rating.
Yeah, well, I've been on the railroad too long, but
I'm just kidding, just kidding.
So when you say real tools, what do those tools consist of?
Well, what I mean is, so for example, a robust radios, good radios, and everybody having because when I started out, we would have one radio for 3 people. And you can imagine how that wasn't exactly the best way to make sure you have instantaneous communication with everybody about something that's important. We would constantly be having to hand off the radio to the guy who was going to be on the lead or whatever, and things like that. So radios would be a good example. Cell phones arguably are a good example, except that we're not allowed to use them when we're operating. But when you're not operating, to be able to reach mechanical help, or to be able to reach people who can make decisions, or people who can send rescues, or things like that, those are big advances. So technology has a role, but there's a tendency to try and just use technology as the way to get rid of people. And then the jobs that those people historically did are not replaced. I think I've probably told you all this before. I testified in the Maryland State Assembly about 6 years ago, I think, on a rail safety bill in Maryland. And I was waiting our turn, and the panel of people that the American Association of Railroads were testifying. And at one point, one of the assembled delegates asked the guy from the AAR what if you got rid of the conductor, because this is one of the things they were talking about, who would do that work? Meaning, presumably, what they understand that the conductor has a bunch of responsibilities on, for knowing what's in the consist and where it is, and if you had to do something with it, how would you do it and stuff. So the guy, and I think he's still there. He gets his cell phone out and he waves it in the air, and he goes, "We have an app. We have an app that takes care of all of that." And I could just look around. There's 100 delegates in this space, and their eyes glaze over, and you could just say, "Oh, they've got an app. Well, we're good." And I knew at that point that I didn't even really need to be there anymore. We had already lost on this question, but and we did lose on it. But and they had done, for example, they had a bunch of fire chiefs. They had all these fire chiefs that they had bought off by buying $1 million pieces of fancy equipment and things like that. And then when the delegates would ask them, "Well, do you all have any concerns about response to hazardous, waste, or, bad problems on the rails or things like that?" And they're all like, "Oh no, we're good. We're good." And so it completely undercut our ability to, make sure that there is a robust, resilient, redundant, and redundancy is a big part of this, right? In other words, like, if one person is incapacitated, you want somebody else to be there that can do something about it. So now the carriers will take, and I'm taking you a bunch of different places, but so there was a terrible wreck up in Canada, on the North Shore in Labrador. It was the first railroad in North America to run single crew operations. And in this particular wreck, the engineer was killed because of the nature of the wreck. And, we were making the argument that, if there was somebody else on the train, there would be something else that could be done in that situation. And their argument was, well, we would probably have them on the head end and they'd both be dead. So there'd be no reason to have, more than one person on the crew. And it's kind of hard to argue the specifics of that, but the point is that we're supposed to collectively, all of us, all the stakeholders, figure out how to do this without killing people. So,
Well, can I ask another question unless somebody else has another question? I don't want to hog up the,
No, go
okay,
ahead.
okay. Now, have they counted, let's see. My thing is, if there is an accident with a train accident with that has been operated remotely, have they, can you imagine, I guess, the lawsuit against the rail companies?
well, let me be clear about one thing, which is that when they do this RCO, typically where possible, the guy with the belt pack, the guy or the woman who has the belt pack, will actually be on the head end. Like they might be out on the platform or on the ladder or something or other like that, but they'll actually be on the equipment in the direction that it's going. Whatever they, on the other hand, if they, depending on how long it is, they might not be able to do this, but if they want to clear a switch, they can get off and make the train go up past the switch and then back up. And those are the questions where you're going to end up with the blind, where there's nobody on a leading end. But hopefully they don't do that with really long trains. Because you just can't be, just because you've cleared the rail 2 minutes ago, that does not, in fact, mean that it's still clear when you go back, right? So, but there is a lot of hubris here. The hubris is that they're just like, that's not, such and such is not going to happen, whatever like that. And of course, there are examples where it does happen. And then, so then the main thing about the 2-person crew, in a sense, is it's not so much, I mean, there's an argument about why you want at least a minimum of 2 on there when you're running, but where you really want to at least is when the bad thing happens, right? So if there's a wreck or a crash or you're on a crossing, or there's a fire, or you need to uncouple, or you need to back up a little bit, that's when you need to have 2 people on the crew. And their argument is, well, what we might do is we might have a guy in a truck 5 miles away. Well, that's not going to solve your problem. UP wants to do that. UP's got a big plan to, they keep pushing it. And there's some of the others that like this idea too. They're like, well, we'll just have a guy in a truck and he'll be kind of like going along parallel or whatever like that. But we know cases where, lives have been saved where, the conductor's actually able to save a kid who's on the tracks or something like that.
Right.
Because there still has to be somebody on the train. But there's all these kind, like like you all are pretty familiar with the Megantic situation. And one of the things about Megantic was there are 5 road crossings in the town of Knott. And because they wouldn't put a conductor on that train, they couldn't park the train on the flat where it wouldn't have been as subject to the problems of the grade and whatnot like that, because it would block all of those crossings and it would block them for fire trucks and everything like that. Now, in the US, a lot of places, they just go ahead and do that anyway. And it's just, somebody's personal problem. They can't get home, or their kids have to cross the train to get to school or whatever. But historically, you'd have enough people on the train so you could cut the crossing for however long it needed to be done. Maybe it's overnight, right? Because that's the way they operate. A lot of these things were like that. So you don't want a whole community to be cut off from civilization for all that length of time like that. And it's not necessary if you actually have adequate crew. So this comes back to the question of give us tools. Don't just come up with technology to figure out how to run trains with no humans, because there's going to be problems if you do that. Give us tools, give us the things that we need, give us adequate rest, give us the things that we have to have in order to be able to be good at our jobs. And then if somebody screws up, then you have a right, and the public has a right to expect some kind of, liability in that regard. But not when you create the problem and then you decide, okay, well, it's the last guy, which is, for example, what happened in Megantic or a lot of other places where it's like they create all of the problems and they take none of the responsibility and they blame it on the last guy.
That was one of the issues with the that I found with Lac Megantic. This is not an accident, which was phenomenal. And I still hope one day we can watch it. But, even when we were at the after party and listening to the producer, even then they still wanted to argue about whether or not he should have put on the brakes, this or that. And, I always go back to the antecedent, like all of that doesn't matter. The guy shouldn't have been running the train.
Absolutely. And they didn't have anybody to call, and they didn't have a fire plan, and they couldn't use the side. I mean, we could go on, which you know these things, but it's a list that's this long. Generally speaking, horrible railroad events take 5 things to go wrong. But then if you just carelessly create a situation where there's 10 things, what do you expect is going to happen? There's going to be a point, mark my words, where this remote control, this RCO, is going to have to come up. It's going to have to be part of this. We're going to have to go to the mat about regulations on RCO, because right now they're doing what they want. And I think Shinda probably knows this. It would be an issue for her husband and her friends, where they just do what they want with RCO. And but there's no safe way to do it. There's no safe, and this is in our own organizations, in our own unions, we're going to have to deal with the people who think that it's okay to do RCO, because it's not okay to do RCO. It's a back end run on remote control trains. It's a back end run on minimum crew. We just finished getting a national rule, and carriers have their way. It won't matter about that because they'll be using the belt pack. So I'm letting you know now that you heard it here first. The RCO needs to go.